I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. I've been wanting to talk to someone about psychoactive plants for some time, and it took me a while to track down a guest who could talk with authority on the subject, which I eventually did with the very kind help of Lewis from the Ethnobotanical Assembly. If you don't already know, the Ethnobotanical Assembly is a quarterly online magazine for research, writing and thinking about people-plant relationships. It's free to view, it's beautiful and it opens up conversations around plants you may never have considered before, so I urge you to visit their website, which I've linked to in the show notes. Once Lewis had given me the name Glenn Shepard, I got in touch with Glenn and he was more than happy to chat to me, but he's a busy man and has been travelling between Europe and Brazil, and between me messing up phone call appointments due to time zones and him zipping about, it took a while to make the call, but it was more than worth the wait. And of course, by the time I chatted to him, the devastating fires had taken hold across the Amazon forest, so I was able to ask him about his experiences and get the view on the ground from Glenn, who lives right on the edge of the forest itself. Glenn leads a fascinating life. To me, he's like a real-life movie character. Although I wanted to talk specifically about psychoactive plants, I also wanted to find out a little bit more about what led him to be living and working in Brazil alongside the indigenous people of the Amazon forest.
I've lived in Brazil for 20 years, and I've done a number of different projects with different peoples. My first project in Brazil was actually on the Upper Rio Negro with the Baniwa people. And they were just beginning to sell their traditional basketry into big shopping department stores in São Paulo and Rio. They developed this project where the indigenous artisans were making the baskets in their villages, and then they were transporting them out to Rio, São Paulo, even to Europe, and selling them for value-added economic development. But the people who were buying the baskets started asking questions. Well, what is this made of? Are we chopping down the Amazon rainforest to make these baskets? And so I had just arrived in Brazil, and they heard that I was an ethnobotanist, and they said, "Would you help us evaluate what are the species of plants that they're using, and what is the impact on the environment of harvesting these plants?" So I put together a project with it was actually the Baniwa Indigenous Peoples Federation invited me to do the research. Usually, as ethnobotanists, we come up with a project and go out and ask the Indians, "Can I do this project?" This was the other way around. They actually invited me. "We want you to do this project." And so that was my first project in Brazil, identifying the plants involved. As usual with indigenous crafts, it's not just one plant. There's 4 or 5 different species of the fiber plant, and there's a whole bunch of different species used as colors and dyes and fixers. And so in the end, it turned out to be this very rich, 15 or 20 plant species. And because the fiber plants that they use to make these baskets, they actually grow in old garden sites. So it's almost as though the basketry is like a byproduct of their agriculture. So it's actually very, very sustainable because the plants that they use to make the baskets grow in their gardens. So it turned out to be it was very easy to sustain their production of these baskets, these fiber. It's sort of it's like arrowroot. It's the arrowroot family. It's called aruma. And so that was my first experience in Brazil. And it was a piece of work where I was actually called upon by the indigenous peoples to do work that was in their interest.
Yeah. And how much work have you been doing with the psychoactive plants? Did that lead on from there?
When I got to Brazil in the year 2000, there was a big international scandal where there was a Swiss pharmaceutical company that had negotiated with the government of Amazon state to basically get exclusive rights to all of the state of Amazonas' biodiversity for 20 years, something like that, for a very small price. And it led the Brazilian government to denounce it as biopiracy. And so for the first 10 years I was in Brazil, they sort of shut down research. It was very hard to get research on plants. So the question of medicinal plants became very, 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 very taboo in Brazil from 2000 to about 2010. So I stopped working so much with the medicinal plants in Brazil and just continued on my research in Peru. The research I'd already done, just continued publishing and analyzing that data because it became in Brazil, it became a little bit tricky to work with traditional plant knowledge, and indigenous peoples were very suspicious of biopiracy. So I continued that work at a distance, and the work that I'd started in Peru, I sort of continued publishing and analyzing that data.
Do they have a problem with the seeds as well, seed sovereignty?
I mean, in Brazil, you have to be very careful with collecting plants, taking plants out of the country. There's very strict laws about Brazil was, Brazil has a big chip on their shoulder because, of course, the English botanist, I think his name was Henry Wickman, took rubber seeds from Brazil, smuggled them out of Brazil, and took them to Indochina, to Malaysia, to the rubber plantations, and so the collapse of the rubber room was caused by an English botanist who sort of snuck the seeds out. So Brazil is very sensitive about biopiracy for a good reason. You can understand it, but I think they sort of went to a far extreme, and so whereas India and China, also countries with extremely rich biodiversity and incredibly advanced traditional medicinal plant medicine, in those countries, the scientific institutions in the countries have facilitated research, and in India and China and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, you have this huge industry of developing new medicines from plants. Whereas in Brazil, this time frame, sort of late 90s to about 2010, it was all kind of shut down because of these really strict laws. And it's almost as though Brazil sort of missed the boat, because now the drug companies have really moved away from natural products. They're looking more into, gene therapy, and they do 3D modeling of drugs. They sort of know what their target molecule looks like, and they model it. And so there was an opportunity, I think, from the 1990s, early 2000s, to really develop some interesting drugs from rainforest plants. And there was all that, there's all the big news the Amazon could save the planet. There's all these great drugs out there, and Brazil and other South American countries, sort of the excessive paranoia made them clamp down so tight on research that not a whole lot of research was done, which was, I think it was sort of a missed opportunity.
So you're talking about medicinal plants, and I
Right.
was wanting to talk about the psychoactive plants.
Sure.
Are they classed as medicinal plants?
Yes. I mean, for the different Amazonian peoples that I've worked with, and I've worked with several different groups who use psychoactive plants, the psychoactive plants they always have a medicinal use in addition to their psychoactive use, almost always. And they're considered to be medicines in and of themselves, shamanic medicines. So you have things like ayahuasca, you have things like ebena, or the snuff, Virola snuff, ebena, in the upper, in the northwest Amazon. You have ayahuasca in the western Amazon, and they are considered to be in and of themselves medicines that shamans use to diagnose illness. So they're never used sort of for recreational purposes. They're always used in a healing context.
Okay, so could that be an issue that somebody might have with their body, or would they also treat them for anything to do with the mind?
Well, I mean, the way they think of it, it's not so much. We sort of divide things body, mind, and with the indigenous peoples of the Amazon that I've worked with, that's not the main distinction: body, mind, psychiatric, physical illness. Sometimes things that we would consider to be a physical illness, like, I don't know, someone has severe diarrhea or vomiting, they sometimes interpret that as being the revenge of an animal, like an animal. You go out and hunt an animal, and by hunting the animal, you offend the animal spirit, and the animal will come back and then attack your child, and your child will get diarrhea or vomiting or something like that. And so even something that we as Westerners would consider to be a physical illness, like vomiting, diarrhea, can have a spiritual underpinning. And so the distinction that they make when they're talking about whether they're going to go to a shaman, or whether they're going to take an herb, or whether they're going to go to the health post. I mean, because these people live, most indigenous peoples today of the Amazon have contact with Western medicine, and just because the fact that they are in contact with Western medicine doesn't mean that either herbal medicine or shamanic medicine dies out. I mean, what they'll say is, you get a headache, or you get some sort of scratching illness on your body, or you get diarrhea, or you get really skinny, and you go to the health post and you take medicines, you don't get better. And you try some herbs and you take those, you don't get better. And in fact, you get worse. And they say when that happens, you know that there's an underlying spiritual component, whether that's witchcraft, someone's envious has cast a spell, or whether there's some animal spirit or forest spirit that's attacking you. So the diagnostic criteria is, it's not like a mental illness or a bodily illness. It's an illness that doesn't get better when you do the normal treatment methods. And then there's something underlying it. There's something inside you that needs to be removed, and only shaman can remove that. And that can be anything from a spine. They'll say that some animal spirit or some forest spirit has embedded a spine into you, and that it's like a hidden spine somewhere in your body, and the shaman has to suck the spine out. Or sometimes it can be, they'll say someone was envious of you because you didn't share antibiotic lotion with them. They need an antibiotic lotion, you didn't share it with them, and they'll bewitch you. And then the shaman can go and he'll take his plants and go into trance, and then he'll pull out a little bottle of a little tube of antibiotic lotion from your body, and that's the cause of the pain that you're feeling.
So when we there's more of an interest in this kind of thing in the West now. I was speaking to somebody a couple of days ago who'd been on a retreat in the UK with a Brazilian tribe, and he had taken ayahuasca. But are we in the West using these things in a completely different way to what they're intended? It sounds as if we are. It sounds as if we're using them for a kind of spiritual experience, whereas actually it's more from a medicinal point of view for the people, the indigenous people.
I mean, ayahuasca has, 50 years ago, we didn't even know what the botanical, 50, 60 years ago, we didn't know what the botanical identifier of ayahuasca was. There's still, Richard Schultes is the one who finally figured out the composition of the brew, mixing two different plants. So it's a very mysterious plant. And then over the past 50 years, there's been this incredible international expansion where now ayahuasca is probably taken in every big city in the world. There's probably an ayahuasca ceremony once a week. It's gone everywhere. And with that expansion, of course, the use has changed. I mean, some people will say it's been corrupted, but I would say that the uses have been adapted to a different setting. Really, when indigenous shamanism in its really traditional context, it's much about hunting, actually, it is about healing, because among the Machiginga people where I work in Peru, every rainy season they take ayahuasca once a week or twice a week. And they say, why take ayahuasca? I'm taking ayahuasca to be a better hunter, because when you can't hunt, that is like a sickness. When people lose their ability to hunt, they shoot their arrows and they miss the animal, or they go in the animal, they don't even see the animal. They need to purify their body. They say that as you hunt an animal and then you don't cook it properly, or if you waste the meat, then the animal, your body gets the smell. It's like if you cook an animal and burn the meat, or you let the pot boil over, then what that means is that you've wasted the meat of that animal. And so you go into the woods and the animal smells you as if you're a vulture full of carrion. And the animal says, I won't go near that guy. He's gonna waste my meat. And so the traditional use of ayahuasca among the Machiginga is really as much about hunting. You take ayahuasca, you purge your body of this, you vomit, obviously. Mm-hmm. And by vomiting, you get rid of this carrion odor that's accumulated in your body from not following the taboo, for not following from violating food taboos, or from wasting meat, or from for killing an animal and the animal goes off in the woods and dies and you don't recover it. All those things fill your body with this rancid smell of rotten meat. And so by taking ayahuasca and throwing up all that stuff, you purify your body. When you go out in the woods, you see animals and hunt animals. So not being able to hunt is an illness in of itself. And then also ayahuasca is used on occasion for curing people who are sick, but it's much about hunting. And then the curing, ayahuasca curing also often involves healing of either witchcraft illness, where someone has bewitched, someone who's been envious will bewitch you, or there's some spirit in the forest that attacks you. And so there's almost an element of warfare. There's, the shaman is sort of protecting the patient from all of these, from vengeful animals or from envious humans. And so there's a whole sort of element attack and revenge warfare going on in Amazonian healing. And of course, when ayahuasca goes out into the West, people are using ayahuasca to treat, post-traumatic stress disorder, to delve into childhood trauma, to overcome, psychological illnesses, to overcome, hang-ups. And so that has very little to do with the origins of its use. And so there are some contradictions, and I think there's some problems in the way it's being used because it's so different than so I'm doing traditional ayahuasca shamanic treat to treat childhood trauma. Well, no one in the Amazon takes ayahuasca to treat childhood trauma. They take it for other things. But I don't think these uses are illegitimate. I think they're different, and I think it's important to recognize that these indigenous ways have been adapted and changed to meet. I mean, in a sense, indigenous shamans sort of cater. It's become a business model. I mean, the indigenous people know that Western people want to come and take ayahuasca, so they create a setting that's more comfortable for Western people. They create methods. You have to pay for it, so it's changed a lot from its traditional origins. But I wouldn't say that it's not legitimate. I think it's different.
And are there any implications for Indigenous people if this, becomes more widespread, or, if it? I don't know what the kind of legal implications might be. Can you see it causing any problems on that front?
For sure. One problem is just Indigenous people's rights. Indigenous communities can sometimes, they can have problems with. They can be poor. They can have poor health. They can have, not very good services, not good education. And this knowledge is sort of taken out of that context with no real benefits and returns to them, and goes into the West and falls into the hands of, some people who might be, legitimate, sincere healers, and some people who might be charlatans selling it to the highest bidder. And so a group of Colombian ayahuasca healers produced a set of documents. There were Americans going to Colombia, or foreigners, Europeans, Americans, going to Colombia claiming to be traditional healers. And they said, no, that knowledge, only we can confer that, that title onto people. And I guess they can't prohibit people from using ayahuasca, but they want to take control over those who claim to be true indigenous healers. So that's one element of it is, what do you call that? What do you call it? Sort of taking advantage of indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, it's exploitative, I suppose.
Yeah, no, there's another word for it. Sort of taking over that cultural heritage.
Appropriating.
Appropriation, but appropriating without any return. So that's one danger. Another danger is just there was a very famous, notorious case of a researcher who went to Ecuador and tried to patent. He actually did patent the ayahuasca vine, the ayahuasca mixture. He worked with some indigenous Ecuadorians, and then came out and patented the vine. He didn't end up making a product out of it, but he did successfully patent the mixture. And that's obviously very problematic. Take something that's been used for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, and someone to come in and patent it and claim that they have the right to use that. So that's another danger. And then there's also the danger of overexploitation, because ayahuasca is now it's in some places in the Amazon, it's harvested commercially, and they harvest it, they boil it down to the most concentrated possible form, like a gelatin paste form, and export it to Europe to these different ayahuasca groups, and it's become like in some places it can even become rare because it's being cut down too much. So there's even ecological threat to the sustainability if it's used in an exploitative way without taking care of the sustainability. And then there's also depending on the country, ayahuasca it's in a dubious legal status in a lot of countries. In the United States, there was a Supreme Court case in the late 2000s, sort of like peyote, where ayahuasca was legalized for religious use. But in a lot of European countries, it's not. Like in France, there have been in France and Spain, there have been legitimate indigenous healers traveling in Europe who've been put in jail because in these countries ayahuasca is considered to be an abusive drug like any like cocaine or heroin, and so there have been indigenous healers who have actually been jailed for coming to Europe and doing ayahuasca sessions.
I did wonder about that, actually. I mean, because as you say, we are using it in probably not in a recreational sense, but we are not, I don't think, giving it the appropriate kind of cultural significance when we use it in the West. So, yeah, I can't see that it can be legal, you know, in the future.
Well, there's been several court cases, and you know, I know that in Holland there was in one of these cases in the European court system, someone was appealing the case of one of these traditional healers who was in prison, and there was a decision in Holland, but it applied to the European Union that understood ayahuasca not as a drug but as a religious substance, which it is. But then, like you said, are these uses, you know, in these other contexts, are they really religious, or are they more therapeutic, or are they more recreational? The distinctions become blurred. And so there was an initial opinion that it shouldn't be considered a drug because of this context. But then, more recently, you know, those interpretations change, and more recently, that interpretation has been questioned, especially in France, where the French legal system is much more strict about any sort of, well, they're strict about drugs, but French legal system is very punitive of what they consider religious cults. Anything that smacks of being a religious cult can be very persecuted. And so some of these ayahuasca religions from Brazil are treated as cults and not cults in France rather than as religions.
Interesting.
So it's sort of a whole can of worms when it leaves its traditional context, its traditional use patterns, goes into the Western world of commerce and psychotherapy and alternative therapy. And there's even people in Europe and elsewhere who have found other plants or pharmacological substances that have, it's sort of the same mixture as ayahuasca, chemically speaking, but it's not the same plant. And they create these new pharmacological potions of ayahuasca. And the traditional healers from Amazon say if it's not made with these two plants, it's not ayahuasca. And yet these other users say, well, we can take these two other plants from other parts of the world that aren't, you know, not from the Amazon. You can take other plants that have the same chemical components and boil them down and create something with the same chemical structure. Is that the same thing or not? And that's, you know, it's another, it's a difficult question to answer. Just because you have the same chemical substance, and the way the indigenous people understand it, ayahuasca and the various plants you mix with it, they're living beings who confer their intelligence and power to the person who consumes them. Whereas if you just take the pure chemical substances and mix them, that would no longer be a sacred substance. Whereas some people say, well, it gives the same effect. That's considered to be a legitimate use too. So there's all these questions that have opened up as ayahuasca has expanded and commercialized throughout the world.
Yeah, because as you say, the plant is part of the experience, and when you take it out of that context, it makes me wonder, because it's very specific to a place, and obviously if you're from that place, I suspect you would have a different experience of ayahuasca than somebody who was using it in say the UK. And it might be a silly question, but has anybody actually documented the differences in experiences that people have when they take ayahuasca, if, you know, dependent on their culture?
Well, there's been a study. It's been questioned a lot, but there was a study by an Israeli psychiatrist or psychologist. I think his name is Benny Sharon, and he gave ayahuasca. He studied people who non-indigenous peoples, Europeans, who had taken ayahuasca, and he documented their visions and their feelings, things that they thought, and he sort of categorized the visions, and he documented a number of what he considers to be universal patterns, many of which match up with some of the things that indigenous people talk about. Seeing jaguars, tigers, feline animals, seeing forest trees, nature spirits, a sensation of vines growing. Anyway, he did a study where in his interpretation, although there are a lot of cultural variations, he considered that there were certain core elements of the ayahuasca visionary experience that transcend the cultures. It's a somewhat subjective study, and people have criticized it for being overly generalizing, but it's a very interesting study showing that there do seem to be some core elements that you see across cultures, even people who aren't from the Amazon, that seem to reflect some of the things that Amazonian people talk about. It's an interesting study.
It sounds fascinating. Have you done it yourself?
Oh yeah, many times.
And would you recommend people try it, or would you say that's very dependent on who they are and where they are?
Well, I'd say, I mean, when I first heard about ayahuasca, I really wanted to. I got to take this stuff. I went to the Amazon. I got to find this stuff, and my first experience was actually very bad, because I just sort of, whatever the first chance I had, I got to take this stuff, and I did it, and it was a very bad experience. And then I didn't take it for a long time until I found a context where I felt much more comfortable with the people in sort of I took it in one of these more commercial kind of contexts in a more urban area, and it was just a really bad experience. And then years later, I was working with the Machininga Indians, and they said they didn't take it anymore, but they did take it. They just weren't telling it to me. And so finally, when they involved me in their rituals, then I discovered something very positive and very wonderful, actually. And so I guess I'd say that you definitely you don't want to go out and find it. You want to let it find you in a way. I mean, don't sort of go out and take the first charlatan who's selling it on the corner. You kind of want to be in a context where you feel comfortable and at ease and with people that you trust and know, and then it can be a very positive experience. It's every time is different. There's no sort of universal. Every single time is very different, and it can be very tough and very it can be very challenging, and it can be very wonderful. It's very different, but definitely it's something to be reckoned with. It's no fun. It's not a fun thing to take, but it definitely. I mean, the indigenous people say it's kind of like the university. You go to the university for one day, what are you going to learn? But if you keep going back to it, it opens up a way of knowing the world that's very different from our Western way of knowing the world. That can be very enriching to a life.
Yeah, I can tell speaking to you that I think I'm quite open-minded, but obviously I'm just so ingrained in that kind of Western way of thinking that, you don't realise day to day how much you kind of take everything on board and express that in every day of your life. Well, thank you very much for speaking to me, and I will probably, I'll let you go now because I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. But before you go, I just wondered how things were going. We're kind of all out in the streets over here over the rainforest burning. Are you kind of okay where you are? Is it as horrendous as the media are making out?
It's pretty bad. I'm not in the place that is burning right now. I'm in Europe right now, but I just left Brazil. But it's definitely, the burning has gotten worse from last year, and I think it's definitely there's been a response to the new president. The Brazilian president has sort of let it be known in his public statements he's not going to enforce the law. And so a lot of lawless people are out there. I remember the very first day he was elected in Manaus, the morning after his election, the whole city was covered in smoke because just people went out and burned forests just to show that they could. Yeah. And so that was just one day after his election, just joy burners just went out and started burning, and the whole city was covered in smoke that first day. And this is now the dry season when people are doing agriculture, and there's just a sense of lawlessness and impunity. People know, well, he's sort of turned a blind eye. He's illegal mining has gone rampant. Illegal logging is rampant. Invasion of indigenous lands is rampant. And now this burning, when the Brazil's Space Agency alerted the country, our satellites have shown that, forest burning is up by, almost 3 times what it was during the same period last year. And his environmental minister said, that's not true. That's not true. And he said, and he was fired. And when the head of the Brazilian Space Agency responded to this ludicrous anti-scientific charge that the satellite, he says, yes, it is true. These are the facts. He was fired. He lost his job. So there's a sense of, denial of scientific facts and rhetoric that inflames the most racist people in the country, and the miners and the loggers and the farmers who are cutting forests down. they know that they're not going to be punished, and so they're just taking advantage of when this government that denies facts and incentivizes people to break the law, because all this stuff that's being done is illegal. These fires are illegal. The gold mining is illegal. Invading indigenous lands is illegal. The logging that's being done is illegal. But there's a sense that the government is turning a blind eye and even incentivizing people to do this, and people are doing it. And so words have consequences. But it seems like there's been a very strong international reaction, and he's kind of backpedaled from some of his most extreme statements. He's being, people are in Europe are threatening to stop buying Brazilian beef because of the impacts, and so it seems like his words have come back to bite him. We'll see if the international pressure keeps up. That's really important. The international pressure is very important because Brazil depends on its exports. And what's fueling all this is exporting soybeans, exporting beef. And if people can, put pressure and boycott and push back against this, then that does actually have an impact. I just saw a statistic that, of all the fires, these fires are affecting something like 150 different indigenous territories that are being affected by these fires. And the logging and the illegal mining is directly impacting indigenous peoples. So it's in addition to hurting by, the global climate and global biodiversity, it's directly affecting indigenous peoples in Brazil. So it's a very relevant question to ask.
And I hope you didn't mind me asking that question. I know this episode was slightly longer than normal, but I thought it was a great opportunity to get a perspective on the situation from inside Brazil. And you and Glenn are both lucky it didn't run any longer, because I could have spoken to him for hours. I've put links in the show notes to where you can find Glenn online, and I think you'll find his blog a great read, so do check that out. As always, thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.